So it's now my great pleasure to welcome back Dr. Ben Chang, who, as you will know if you came last time, he's a writer and speaker, and he's an emergency medicine registrar working in North London, only a few miles from where I'm speaking to you as well. He's the author of the new book, Christ and the Culture Wars, Speaking for Jesus in a World of Identity Politics, which is published by Christian Focus Publications. And Ben speaks regularly at conferences, churches, and universities. And he's going to be challenging us on this very difficult subject, apologetics in a post-truth world. So Ben, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's really great to be with you. It's a real privilege to be with you and to be back. As Howard said, my name is Ben. And today we're going to be looking at this concept of post-truth. And in particular, how we can share and defend our beliefs as Christians living in a post-truth, post-modern world. And thank you for the cheeky plug of my book. Just to mention that we'll be picking up some of the ideas in the book, Christ and the Culture Wars, which I wrote and published earlier this year. And it's available now everywhere you normally get your books. So this is where we're going over the next half hour or so. We're going to be starting by asking the question, where are we when it comes to post-truth and our postmodern world? What's going on in our world? Then secondly, we're going to be asking, why are we here? How have we got to this point in our world in which truth has kind of lost its currency? And then we're going to be ending with the question, where should we go? Where should we go, and how should we speak and act in this post-truth world? And in particular, how can we defend our faith? How can we engage in apologetics in a modern post-truth world? And then after that time, we'll obviously have time for questions, which I look forward to. So let me begin by asking, where are we when it comes to post-truth? Well, the phrase post-truth has only really been around for the past 7 or 8 years. And in particular, it was in 2016 that the phrase became popular in political commentary. And it was named the word of the year by the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, as some of you may have already figured out from this slide, there were 2 major world events that happened in 2016 that clearly contributed to the proliferation of the use of the phrase post-truth. And these were the election of Donald Trump as president of the US and the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. And the phrase post-truth is used quite broadly to refer to a range of different things. But essentially, it describes a culture in which truth claims are viewed as relative rather than objective. Political statements are propagated and popularized based on their political capital rather than factual credibility. And appeals to science, reason, and evidence are trumped by individuals' personal convictions and, quote, lived experiences. The post-truth world is a world where truth has lost its currency. And I would suggest that this post-truth culture is the dominant one in the Western world today. I think Trump and Brexit were just 2 of the earthquakes caused by a much broader shifting of cultural tectonic plates. And clearly, this poses a big problem for evangelism and apologetics. How can we convince others of things we believe to be true about God, about humanity, about reality, if truth itself has lost its currency? So that is a very brief introduction to this idea of post-truth. Now, at this point, I think it is helpful to hit pause and then rewind and to look backwards at the philosophies and ideas that have paved the way for this post-truth culture. Why are we here? I like this quote from author Terry Pratchett. If you don't know where you come from, then you don't know where you are. And if you don't know where you are, then you don't know where you're going. And if you don't know where you're going, you're probably going wrong. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at where we have come from. And I would suggest that our post-truth culture is the result of several layers of philosophies, ideologies, and cultural events that have combined and in some cases amplified each other in order to form the culture we have today. And I have 5 brief cultural layers for you. My first layer is the rise of so-called expressive individualism. Now, expressive individualism was an idea coined by Robert Bellah and then was popularized by Charles Taylor. And this is the idea that meaning and significance to life can be found through the external expression of internalized desires, dreams, and definitions. I am who I say I am. And so, for the expressive individual, the thing that matters most in life is not the truth out there in the world waiting to be discovered, but it's the truth in here that is waiting to be expressed. It doesn't matter what the world says is true. What matters is what you believe on the inside. Now, the influence of expressive individualism is seen right across our modern culture. Let me just give you one brief example. This is a quote from the Scottish government's Supporting Transgender Pupils in Schools guidance published in August 2021. So this is published by the government in Scotland and outlines the recommendations to Scottish teachers. It made a number of recommendations, including this. If a young person comes out to you as transgender, it's also important not to deny their identity or overly question their understanding of their gender identity. According to the Scottish government, when it comes to the gender of children, it doesn't matter what the teachers or parents think, and it certainly doesn't matter what biological reality is. No, what matters is what the child feels is right. And to question that would be to question that child's very identity. So firstly, we have the rise of expressive individualism. But secondly, and closely related, we have the romantic ideas of philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Jean-Jacques Rousseau proposed that human beings are born with innate and natural moral virtue and innocence. And this innate innocence is then corrupted by societal pressures and external influences. I suggest in the book that I think this is, in a sense, the opposite of Augustine's doctrine of original sin. So original sin says all humans, Jesus notwithstanding, are born into an inherently sinful human nature. Rousseau says that all humans are born into an inherently pure and righteous nature, which is then corrupted by society. This is summarized in Rousseau's most famous adage, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. Now, there are many areas in today's culture where we can see Rousseau's influence. For example, we see it in our culture's suspicion of traditional authority figures and institutions. You see, many institutions that have been traditionally seen as bastions of truth, knowledge, and education, such as the university or school or family unit, or even church, These institutions are now viewed as oppressive forces that corrupt the purity of the expressive individual. I think this is behind the drive for, quote, safe spaces at universities and the widespread culture of cancelling, or at least protesting against, speakers who hold views that make students feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Such protesters argue that speakers should not be given platforms in schools or universities if their views make people feel uncomfortable, regardless of whether their views are true or not. But what I think is even more disconcerting is that this narrative of suspicion of authority is seeping into how our children are taught to view their parents. So let me just give you one example in the form of a recent film. So this is the film Elemental. It was the new Disney and Pixar animated film that came out in July of this year. The story is based around a girl made of fire, a fire girl called Ember, who is being prepared to take over her father's little family shop when he retires. However, Ember meets and falls in love with a water boy called Wade. And when visiting Wade's family, Ember gets offered a job as a glass maker, which kind of makes sense for someone made of fire. And she realizes that she doesn't want to take over her dad's shop. She wants to follow her dream as a glass maker. And then this happens, and I'm going to attempt and hope that technology is on our side as I play this clip.
I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky I have you.
Where are you going?
Back to my life at the shop, where I belong. I take over tomorrow.
Whoa, hold up. You don't want that.
Yeah, that may work in your rich kid follow your heart family, but getting to do what you want is a luxury, and not for people like me.
Funny. This whole time I thought you were so strong. But turns out, you're just afraid.
I'm fire, Wade! I can't be anything more than that. It's what I am and what my family is. And that alone is a reason this could never work. It's over, Wade.
So I hope that clip worked for you. But if you missed it, the kind of key dialogue that happened there was Ember saying, getting to do what you want is a luxury and not for people like me. And then Wade responds, fine, this whole time I thought you were so strong, but turns out you're just afraid. Now, I think this is a really interesting clip for a few reasons, but namely, I think this is interesting because in this interaction between the two protagonists, strength is defined by Ember's ability to do what she wants, even if it means disobeying her parents. Which, if you think about it, it seems like the wrong way around, right? Normally, strength means doing what you don't want to do, not doing what you do want to do. And the whole film culminates in Ember's finding this strength and doing what she wants, not what her parents want. This is what our kids are being taught in the films they watch. And of course, this poses quite a big challenge to parents, as we'll come back to a little later on. Thirdly, and a little bit more briefly, we have the big influence of postmodernism. Postmodernism developed in the late 20th century, and it sought to push back against the modernistic Enlightenment ideas of rationality and objectivity. Instead, postmodernism sees truth claims as relative as opposed to objective. What's true for you doesn't need to be true for me. Here's how the postmodern philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard put it. Postmodernism expresses incredulity toward meta-narratives. Knowledge makes no claims to being original or even true, and should not be accorded predictive value in relation to reality, but strategic value in relation to the questions raised. Michael Foucault then went even further and argued that appeals to objective reality are nothing more than exercises of power used by the strong to oppress the weak. It's not about truth. It's all about power. There are lots of examples of postmodernism in action today, but I think the most vivid example is the trans rights movement, which is driven by the idea, the principle, that a person's subjective experience of gender identity is of far greater importance and significance than their biological sex. Even the phrase sex assigned at birth to refer to biological sex implies that biological sex itself is not objective, but is subjectively decided by midwives and or parents. You could perhaps think about the postmodern influence in our culture a bit like this. If modernity and the Enlightenment form the era of facts don't care about your feelings, well, postmodernity could perhaps be seen as the era of feelings don't care about your facts. So we've looked at expressive individualism, Rousseau, postmodernism. Fourthly even, we have the massive impact of social media. Now, social media is transforming the world in ways we are only beginning to understand now. And social media has had several major parts to play in the evolution of our post-truth world. Firstly, I think social media has essentially turbocharged the first three of our philosophical layers. So, if expressive individualism says meaning in life is found through the outward expression of our inward desires and definitions, well then social media gives this seemingly perfect means by which people can create whatever online identity they like and then broadcast that identity to potentially millions. If Rousseau said that society corrupts individuals' pure identities, then the social media algorithms, which link people together with similar views and encase them in echo chambers, well, I think this then provides the ideal platform to galvanize a social revolution against traditional authority figures. And if postmodernism says that truth is relative and reality is whatever you want it to be, well, then social media allows people to create whatever reality their imaginations can conjure up. I came across this advert on Instagram for Instagram Reels. I haven't been able to figure out why Instagram needs to advertise Instagram on Instagram, but that aside, this is the caption of the advert. Make yourself in your own image. Explore who you can be with Reels. Hashtag yours to make. It's very postmodern. Your image, identity, and reality are simply yours to make. So social media has turbocharged our first three philosophical layers. However, social media has also played another crucial role in the evolution of our post-truth society, as it has been the major vehicle for the spread of so-called fake news. You see, under apps such as Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok are AI algorithms that harvest up all the data we generate when we click or type or post things online. And increasingly, they are collecting data on what we say and do offline as well. And then these intelligent algorithms use these to build a picture of who we are and what content they should feed us with that will keep us clicking. But these algorithms don't differentiate between truth and falsehood. We get fed stuff on our news feeds, not because it is true or credible, but because the social media algorithm thinks it'll get our attention. And furthermore, there is now strong evidence that algorithms are focused on getting clicks rather than finding truth are actually more likely to propagate lies. In 2018, this study that was published in the journal Science found that on social media, false claims and fake news stories spread much faster and more widely than true news stories. For example, false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true stories. And I suppose we shouldn't be overly surprised by this. I mean, fake news stories are naturally more likely to be dramatic, exciting, and surprising because they're not true. And therefore, predictably, they get more clicks. So we looked at expressive individualism, Rousseau, postmodernism, social media. Fifth and finally, very briefly, we have the slightly terrifying invention of artificial intelligence to contend with. Now, this could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But in short, we now live in a world where large language models such as ChatGPT can write texts indistinguishable from human authors, and where image and video generating softwares can synthesize pretty much any reality right before our eyes. Now, if this technology keeps on growing and developing at the pace it is today, and I can't see a reason why it won't, then I think we are going to very quickly find ourselves in a world where we ordinary Mark I humans will not be able to tell the difference between what is fake and what is real. If that comes true, well, that's going to be huge. Are we going to have to default to presuming that all words, videos, and pictures we see online might be fake until proven otherwise? And what will that do to our conceptualization of truth? Honestly, I'm not sure. So those are our five philosophical and cultural layers that I think have most contributed to the post-truth culture we have today. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's my attempt at kind of summarizing why we are here. So the big question is, what do we do now? And how can we speak and defend the truth of the gospel in this post-truth world? Well, clearly, there's a lot that can be said on this topic, and I go into much more detail in the book. But in short, I would like to propose that we Christians need to develop a new type of postmodern apologetics. I think to engage in apologetics in our post-truth world, we need to develop a new kind of postmodern apologetics. You see, traditional apologetics, at least in its popular form, are developed in a modernistic culture where all people, religious or not, generally believed in the authority of logic, reason, evidence, and science. And therefore, Christian apologists could build intellectual cases for why our Christian beliefs are true and our opponents' beliefs are false. And clearly, there has been much gospel fruit produced by traditional apologetics. In his new book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, journalist Justin Brierley tracks how the new atheist movement of Richard Dawkins and friends once appeared to be the most threatening challenge to the modern church. But now, it has basically faded into irrelevance. Now, this has partly been because of the internal politics of the new atheism movement. But new atheism's demise also came about in no small part because of the work of apologists like John Lennox, who bravely took on the arguments of Dawkins in public and at the highest levels of academia. In fact, John Lennox played a key part in my conversion to Christianity back when I was a teenager. So I think the global church owes a great deal to traditional apologists like Lennox and others. And there are some places in which traditional apologetics still gains considerable traction. So I still occasionally get asked to speak at universities that have large science faculties on topics such as, has science disproved God? I definitely believe there is a place for these sorts of debates and talks. However, in the main, our culture has shifted away from the modernistic beliefs in reason and evidence, and towards the postmodern emphases on personal convictions and lived experience, the feelings don't care about your facts culture. In this postmodern culture, rational arguments are not met with counter arguments or even dismissive ridicule. No, they are met with calls to deplatform and cancel speakers who make audience members feel unsafe. And I think our apologetics needs to adapt to our new postmodern world. Rather than setting out to try to show that our beliefs are right and our opponent's beliefs are wrong, I think we need to think through how we can show that the gospel's story is better than what the world can offer. Rather than trying to debate and defeat our opponents, I think we should be trying to attract them to an even more captivating, better story. Of course, this idea is not original to me. This is what my friend Professor Glyn Harrison writes in his book, A Better Story. We cannot engage with a great narrative by deploying more facts. We have to tell a different story, a better story. We must out-narrate those with whom we disagree. We shouldn't use narrative as a cynical debating device to outwit our opponents and win the argument. We need to tell stories because this is how the human mind works. And because Jesus himself paved the way with some of the greatest stories he ever told. Glyn Harrison here is speaking about how Christians should engage with the stories of the sexual revolution. However, I think his principles apply much more broadly in our postmodern culture. Here's another quote in a similar vein, this time from Australian evangelist Sam Chan in his book Evangelism in a Skeptical World. We should use more stories in our evangelism. In modernity, people preferred hearing propositional data. Give me the facts. But in postmodernity, people prefer hearing stories. Show me what this looks like. But stories also work well because they invite the hearer to see the world through our eyes. The hearer has to suspend their disbelief and enter my world. I think we need to develop a whole new type of postmodern apologetics that deals primarily not in debates and evidence, but in stories and narratives. I think our aim should be to show people how attractive and appealing the Bible story is when it comes to the issues at the forefront of our culture, such as identity, or justice, or liberty, or dignity. Might the Bible story be better than what our world can offer? And as a bit of a side note, I think this applies perhaps most sharply to ministry to children, both ministry to children in the church and also in the home. Now, clearly, children need to be disciplined and told what they should and shouldn't do. They need to learn the rules. However, when it comes to teaching children ethics, how they should and shouldn't live, for example, when it comes to sex and relationships, I think we need to be aware of the culture they are swimming in, which tells them to be suspicious of authority figures, including their parents. So, telling children don't have sex outside of heterosexual marriage because my house, my rules, or because, well, that's what God says. Well, this approach may simply serve to reinforce the narrative that says that parents in general, and Christian parents in particular, are just oppressive authority figures that need to be fought against and overcome so that children can be their true selves. Perhaps a greater focus should be on trying to show and convince children that saving sex for marriage is better than the alternative, that the Bible's view on sex, relationships, and marriage is more appealing, is more beautiful, is better than what is offered by the sexual revolution, or the Pride movement, or our sexualized world at large. Now, I'm under no illusions that this is easy. I am not a parent and so cannot speak from personal experience, but I think it's something that is worth all of us thinking about. And so, as I come into land, this is the road we've traveled on. We've looked firstly at our post-truth world, where reason, logic, and evidence are trumped by personal convictions and lived experience. We looked at why we are here and gone through some of the philosophical and cultural layers that have built our post-truth culture. And I've suggested that perhaps one way forward would be to develop a new kind of postmodern apologetics that deals primarily not in reason and evidence, but in stories and narratives, and sets out not to show that we are right and our opponents are wrong, but rather that the Bible's story is more attractive, is more captivating, and is better than anything our world can offer. For those who are interested in this topic, these are the books that I have mentioned throughout this talk. So Christ and the Culture Wars by myself, The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God by Justin Briley, which tracks the downfall of new atheism and the rise in the belief in God in the last few years amongst secular thinkers. A Better Story by Glenn Harrison, which looks at how Christians should engage with the sexual revolution. And then Evangelism in a Skeptical World by Sam Chang, which is a bit of an overview of evangelism, and then particularly how can we engage in evangelism in our skeptical, hostile, modern or even postmodern world. And so, as I close, I'd like to close, if I may, on this verse from Paul's sermon in Pisidian Antioch in Acts chapter 13, verse 36. This is what Paul preaches. Now, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep. He was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. In his best-selling book, The Purpose-Driven Life, American pastor Rick Warren suggests that he thinks this verse, these words, are the greatest tribute, the greatest compliment that the Apostle Paul could give King David. And that is this: that David died having served God's purpose in his own generation. This world of fake news, postmodernism, expressive individualism, cancel culture, this is our world. This is our generation. Paul says that David served God's purpose in his own generation. The question is, will we serve God's purpose in ours? Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thanks so much, Ben. That's really challenging, and thank you for crystallizing all the thought that you've been undertaking over the last few years, some of which you've encapsulated in your book, but I think in today's talk you've taken your book even further and given us some real challenges to our thinking. I was listening particularly when you were talking about children and challenging authority, and you showed the cartoon as well. You mentioned that you're not a parent. Well, I've become a grandparent in the last 3 or 4 years, and
congratulations.
Just seems to me, seeing my children look after our grandchildren, their children, how much more difficult it is in this postmodern world. And so I think we'll be having some questions on that. When you said about 2016 being a seminal year, a particularly challenging year, I remember, I think it was probably early 2017 after Trump's election, and at the inauguration, the crowds came to see Donald Trump, but nothing like the numbers that he was expecting. And so there was a disparity between what he said was coming and what you could actually observe. And I never forget his spokesperson, I think it was Kellyanne Conway, who came on and said, the numbers we've got are alternative facts. So it didn't matter what you could see with your own eyes. She was sticking to the alternative facts. That was the first time I'd realized how people could misuse factual information for their own purposes. Although, of course, as we all know, it's been going on for centuries and not just in the last 7 or 8 years. So I just wonder if I could ask you really at the outset, what you think as a doctor yourself, what are the implications for medical science and for doctors in this post-truth world where, as you say, reason, logic, and evidence are trumped by personal convictions and lived experience? We as doctors, we rely on science, we rely on clinical trials, and yet we've got COVID deniers. We've had the MMR anti-vaxxers who seem to get a lot more traction than the facts seem to warrant. So for doctors in this post-truth world, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, a very big question. And you mentioned COVID. I mean, COVID was probably the biggest test of how our post-truth culture would interact with medicine and public health and epidemiology and public health messaging as well. And well, we know what happened. That in the UK, generally speaking, vaccine uptake was high, and that most people were willing to accept the medical information that was coming from the chief medical officer of the government, the health service. But there was plenty of conspiracy theories, both in our country and around the world, plenty of COVID deniers, plenty of all sorts of strange theories around COVID vaccines. And what quickly became apparent was it didn't really matter which kind of credible scientists we put in front of the camera, or how much evidence we put forward, or what kind of numbers n numbers that we had for our studies. It didn't really matter, because there were large numbers of people for whom they believed these conspiracy theories, and nothing that anyone else said to the contrary would change that. And I think this is particularly was particularly because of social media, which very much kind of encases people in echo chambers. And as the epidemiologists and the public health doctors found, it's very hard to penetrate these echo chambers from the outside. If you're in these, if you spend lots of time on social media and you're in this echo chamber that simply reinforces your own pre-existing beliefs, it's very hard to come in from the outside and challenge those beliefs. So clearly COVID and the epidemiological side of things was a big example of this. But also, I think as individual clinicians in our practice, I think we are seeing and will continue to see more and more patients who get their medical information from social media. And perhaps worth thinking about, well, is simply saying, no, the evidence says something else, is that good enough? Is it good enough to say, oh, that website you read was wrong because we have this fact, when actually truth has kind of lost its currency, as we've said? It's a really tricky place we find ourselves in as medics, and one that I think will become more and more prominent as in the not too distant future.
Thank you. Of the questions coming in, Ben, there are several about children, because I think that probably resonated with most of us, even though as doctors, it's the medical question that I posted first. But a couple here: much of the preaching, Sunday school lessons and training of pastors in seminary focus a lot on intellectual understanding of the Bible. What would your thoughts be on changing the way we do church in the light of what you've shared?
There's a few things, and I presume this is particularly in the context of church teaching to young people, although perhaps referring to kind of the broader church teaching as well.
There's another question linked to it, which says much of the preaching, Sunday school lessons. Sorry, just a bit higher than that. Talks about the way we can convince children that Bible stories and narratives are better when today's culture leads them to question the authority of the Bible in the first place. And then there was another one lower down, which I can't quite find at the moment.
As it's a big question, a big topic. And the short answer is, I do think we need to adapt our Bible teaching in our churches, particularly with young people, to this postmodern world that we live in. Even just on a simple kind of pedagogical stance, we often expect teenagers to sit through a 20-30 minute talk, for example, at say conferences or at churches. And actually, when do teenagers do that outside of church? And actually, in contrast, what they're being fed with, say, on social media is very kind of short, sharp, attention-grabbing stimuli. The most popular, according to Statista, the polling company, the most popular social media app amongst children in the United Kingdom is TikTok. So these are kind of streams of like 5 to 10 to 20-second videos that you just scroll through endlessly. And teenagers are just bombarded with kind of stimuli that is attention-grabbing, that is kind of high intensity. And you go from that to then a church Sunday school where they're sitting to one person talking for 20 minutes with no slides, no pictures, no anything. And we wonder why teenagers find it hard to concentrate. So just on a purely sort of pedagogical lens, I think that there is something to be said there. And then also, I just find myself often despairing at how the teaching that we do with teenagers these days is so often just worlds away from the stuff that they're encountering in their lives. Just a very brief kind of anecdote. I was doing a seminar at the Keswick Convention last year with the teenagers. I had about 250 teenagers in a room, and one of the sessions was on transgenderism. And I asked them at the start of that session, can you put your hand up if you've ever had teaching about transgenderism in school? And about 80% of the hands went up. And then I asked them, have you ever had, put your hand up if you've ever had teaching about transgenderism in church? And about 20% of hands went up. And I think that's absolutely insane. We have got to address these topics. We've got to talk about the things that they're hearing from every direction. And we have to then show how the Bible story is better. And, maybe it's just in my circles, but, from my experience, anecdotally, we're not doing a great job.
Really following on from that, Sherry Falkenheimer is asking, what type of stories do you suggest we use in apologetics today? Should it be personal stories, Bible stories? What do you think?
I think all of the above, and it will depend on the situation and depend on the topic and depend on the recipients as well. I think there is a real strong, powerful place for individual stories of people individually finding identity or liberty, that kind of stuff. I think there is certainly a strong and powerful place for that. I think the Bible is full of stories. I think that we underestimate actually how attention grabbing some of the Bible stories are. I mean, I preached through Exodus with a group of teenagers on a camp, and I mean, just reading these stories, trying to think my way through into a teenager's mind. Actually, they're quite interesting. They're quite dramatic. Like they're attention grabbing stories. But I think actually the big thing we need to do is tell the Bible's whole narrative and show that it is better, that it's more attractive than what our world is offering. So, for example, the Bible says, the world is saying that the journey to self-actualization, self-realization, finding your identity comes through expressing your gender identity or expressing your sexual identity or joining a group that is a group of other people who are the same race as you. It's about finding these attributes to you. And then compare that to the Bible story of identity, which says that we are image bearers of God, adopted into God's family, co-heirs with Christ, destined to rule the universe with him. It's so much richer, it's so much better than anything our world can offer, if we will just tell it.
Yeah, absolutely. In your book, Christ and the Culture Wars, you talk about the three typical responses of Christians to the identity crisis and the culture wars, and you say mirror, argue, and
Ignore
was the third one. There's a question here from Angel Wang, which says, what simple responses do we Christians have to counter fake news reports on the internet? Do we ignore them? Do we counter them? Do we argue with them? What do you think is the best way?
It's really difficult, and honestly, I don't have a good kind of easy answer for this. I mean, to be honest, I do have some sympathy with the idea that we do have to pick our battles. That I don't think we necessarily have to engage in every single Twitter dispute or conspiracy theory we see online. We'd be there all day if we did. And also, we've got to pick the hills we die on. But I do think there is something to be said of going to where the need is, and going to where truth is needed, and a lot of the time that is social media. How we do that is, as I say, a challenge. But if fake news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true news stories, then I suppose we should probably be working 70% harder to get the true news stories out there, right? And how we do that is it's something that I'm certainly no expert in, but I suppose we'd have to work hard. We'd have to make sure that as conspiracy theories are being bombarded but people are being bombarded by conspiracy theories, that we need to have as engaging, as attention grabbing stuff as they do. I think that's one thing. I think also kind of realizing that breaking out of our own echo chamber is in and of itself a challenge, and actually making an effort to follow to kind of have within our social media friend circle, as it were, people who will disagree with us, people who are on different ends of the political spectrum, people who are different ends of the religious spectrum, from kind of believers all the way through to atheists. I think following a range of views will help us ourselves not be encased in an echo chamber.
Yeah. Well, there's a question anonymously given here about post-truth. Refers to being in court recently and listening to the barrister tell lies for the other party. And he says, could it be, or she says, could it be that post-truth is not as new as we are made to believe, but is an illustration of the more timeless truth that when men choose not to believe in God, they do not thereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything, quoting Chesterton.
Yes, and I would concur. I mean, it's you can track it all the way back to Genesis 3. The words that come out of Satan's mouth in Genesis 3 are, did God really say? And it's that undermining of truth and the start of lies that was at the very core of the fall of humanity. And so, yeah, absolutely, I think there is being there in the human sinful heart to suppress truth, as Romans 1 says, and to propagate and follow lies. But I certainly think in the last few years, because of the layers that we went through, I think this is becoming more and more our dominant culture in the West, at least.
There's a question from Jane Torrance. Is there any evidence, at least in the West, of a move beyond a post-truth, postmodern world, or a reaction against it? To that I would say, is this post-truth world, like new atheism, a passing phase, or is it here to stay?
Are we entering a post-truth world? So this is commonly asked, and I suppose in some people's eyes, as more and more people buy into this post-truth world, there's also a kind of reactive response from people who are skeptical of it, people who are fighting against cancel culture and safe spaces, people who are trying to fly the flag for reason and evidence and science, and these people are gaining more and more kind of prominence. And so the question is, are we seeing a changing of the tide? Is this culture already beginning to subside? I am not that optimistic, I'm afraid. I actually think we're just getting started. I think we're just seeing the beginning of this post-truth, postmodern culture. And I think what we're observing is polarization. It's what I describe in the book as the mirror response. So as these movements and this culture gets more and more extreme, you get a kind of reactive mirroring response from people who are labeled as oppressive or as the kind of the bad guys in this story. And so you end up with polarization of discourse, of culture, of politics as well. And I think that's what we're observing. But, and I may be completely wrong, but I suspect actually we're just seeing the beginning of this culture, not the end.
So my phone just went off at the awkward time. Ben, we were talking earlier before we started about CMF conferences, and the surprise I had that Christian students in particular, medical students, are much more interested in the topic of decolonialization and Western saviorism than older people are, and they makes them less enthusiastic about overseas Christian medical mission. Do you think that is a symptom of this post-truth world? And what do you think is the best way to counter it? So this is Christian medical students and junior doctors who are really concerned about the impact of mission in the past, and therefore are almost saying, should we be doing it at all?
Very good, very good point. And it's an interesting observation. I wasn't aware of the kind of statistics that you quote, but I can certainly it certainly fits with my experience, especially with medical students. Colonialization and narratives around sort of cultural appropriation is very much at the heart of the racial justice movement of today. And the racial justice movement fits very much into this broader oppressor versus oppressed narrative. So our culture is built on this narrative that the oppressed groups are waking up to their oppression and then rising to fight against their oppressors, whether it be women fighting against the patriarchy, whether it's ethnic minorities fighting against white supremacy, etc., etc. And this is the dominant narrative that this current generation of medical students have basically been swimming in for the last few years and have grown up in. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that current medical students are now much more skeptical of the idea that people from white Western countries can go and quote unquote help people in say the global South, or people who are of different ethnicities. That's the narrative. And, you know, in some regards, I kind of get why. And there is certainly some truth in the narrative that when white missionaries have gone to global southern countries, their impact has not been universally good. That is probably true to say. And I suppose if it's created a better awareness for the need for kind of aid and development coming from the countries themselves, you know, whether it be kind of helping to develop infrastructure, develop training, rather than kind of parachuting medics in for a short time and then taking them out again, that's probably a good thing. But I do also think we have to think about the narrative we've been fed over the last few years, and I think we got to be teaching med students to kind of take a step back and realize that this is the narrative that they've been living through and been influenced by, and asking the question, is it true or not? Is this really the best narrative, that our world is dichotomized into oppressor and oppressed, and if you're not the oppressed, then you must be the oppressor, and you need to check yourself for your oppression? Like, is that really the narrative that best fits our worldview, our Christian worldview? Is there something, you know, bigger and better to say about ourselves? So that's a very long-winded answer to a very big question.
Well, thanks for that, Ben. In fact, I think you're due to be speaking at the Students' Conference in February, so maybe you'll get asked about that, or maybe you could address it before you're even asked it. But thanks for that. Just one last question. It should be fairly straightforward, because I think the answer will be yes, but Carla Hernandez says, what do you think about digital evangelism? How can we reach Gen Z and millennials to Christ through various websites that they would come to, and that we could share gospel narratives on?
Well, my answer is yes, but actually it's quite hard, because, as I say, social media encases people in echo chambers. So if you want to distribute Christian resources amongst Christian teenagers, that's very easy on social media. You just create a WhatsApp group, or get it into the echo chamber, and it'll spin around. The difficulty comes trying to break out of your own echo chamber into another echo chamber. And that's why the idea of social media evangelism, digital evangelism, is actually perhaps not as easy as it sounds. We need to actually somehow manage to create a resource that will manage to break through into other people's echo chambers, and also have enough potency to be able to then spread. And I don't have an easy formula for that. I think it's something that that the tech wizards and the computer scientists perhaps would be good to ask about and to take their lead on. But I certainly think that if we get it right, if there is a way to kind of give gospel evangelistic resources and put them into other echo chambers on social media, I mean, obviously the potential for gospel fruit is enormous. But I think it needs some quite careful thought as to how we do it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ben, and thanks for answering those questions so fulsomely. I think we all welcome the fact that you're wrestling with these questions, that perhaps we've fallen into that one of those categories of either ignoring or wanting to mirror or argue with. So really appreciate all the work you put in for today's presentation. And this is to reassure people that, well, first of all, a reminder about the book, Christ and the Culture Wars, that's available. Other books by the friend that was mentioned by Ben of Glenn Harrison, A Better Story, that's one of Glenn Harrison's books, all worth reading if you're interested in following up on this particular topic. And I'd just like to close with a verse from Philippians to remind us when we're in this world of post-truth, that Paul said, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, anything worthy of praise, think about these things. So as we say, thank you to Ben and goodbye to you all. Think about these things. Thank you.